Yo, what's going on, everybody? This is Nothing But Bangers, aka MBB, aka Bangers, aka I've got the first ever top 32 preview, along with all the data you need for the latest Ursiiday tournament. And the top 32 will be playing out in less than like 24 hours. So hopefully this video gets you ready to go for some of the matchups that we might see, as well as some predictions for the top 32. So let's get to it. So this is a breakdown of the top 32 decks that qualified for day 2 of the Ursiiday tournament. And just a couple of things to point out, and what I've got here is I've got the number of decks in the top cut. I've got the percentage that it takes up in the top cut. And then I've got the original numbers of how many or how the share of percentage that it had of the meta. So let's start off with Mewtwo and Gardevoir, which actually takes up the most spots in the top cut. And so it's 21.9% of the top cut. However, it accounted for 13.61% of the entire decks submitted. Then when you go to Pikachu Zebstrika, there's 6 in the top cut. It accounts for 18.8% of the top cut. And in terms of the entire tournament, it was only 8.92% of the meta. Then you've got Aerodactyl and Primeape. Now this had a very high conversion rate, and what that means is the number of people playing it. So it only had 1.9% of the meta, but 9%. It accounts for 9% of the top cut. So pretty good numbers there. However, this is where we're getting to our first kind of low performing deck, and it had a target on its back. A lot of people were playing snipers, so everybody kind of pointed their ammunition at Gyarados and Greninja. So there's only 3 in the top cut. However, and so it only makes up 9.4% of the top cut, and it was brought by 13.71% of the meta. So a large portion of people brought Gyarados Greninja. Another big surprise and a pretty good conversion rate was Arcazard. There's 3 in the top cut. It accounts for 9.4% of the top cut, and it was only 1.75% of the entire meta. So very good showing for Arcazard. And if you've been watching my power rankings, which by the way you definitely should if you're trying to be good at the game or just keep up with what's going on in the game, I release power rankings about once a week, or at least I try. And Arcazard was actually in my power rankings as well. It was the highest rated fire deck, and as I look at these standings, it performed the best out of all the fire decks. So gotta go there. And then also, just to throw this out there as a plug, I had Mewtwo and Pikachu in my top 3. I think Pikachu was the second deck, Mewtwo was the third deck, and then Gyarados Greninja was the number 1 overall deck. And I gave you some deck lists to go along with it, so you had an idea, and I rated them. So that's just an aside. But anyways, let's keep going through these decks. So Exeggutor Celebi, there's 2 of them in the top cut, counts for 6.3% of the top cut. And going into the tournament, it was about 2.94% of the meta. Which, by the way, I actually had Exeggutor Celebi as quote unquote the best version of Celebi. But it did play superior, and some of these versions, we'll talk about these deck lists in the top cut also, kind of straight away from that. Some of them didn't play superior at all, if I remember right. Then you've got Superior and Celebi accounting for 2 spots in the top cut. And the reason why I've got these decks in red is because they didn't perform as well as the amount that was sent in the metagame. So in other words, there was a lot of people playing it, 5% of the meta, that's a pretty big chunk, and only, it only accounts for 6.3% of the top cut, only two in the top cut. Aerodactyl and Farfetch'd, there was, it's 0.67% of the meta, and it's taking up, 1 spot in the top cut, so pretty good conversion rate. Same for Exeggutor and Mew. 0.21% of the meta, so very small amount of people. I think maybe 1 or 2 brought it, and it converted to the top cut. Blaine's Ninetales, about 0.88% of the meta, and secures a spot in the top cut. Same with Alakazam and Mewtwo. However, it did have a lower meta rate, only 0.57% people brought it to the tournament. And then when you take a look at the Aerodactyl and Mew list, again, even smaller, number of people brought it, only 0.36 of the meta, and it takes up a spot in the top cut. And then rounding out with Pikachu Raichu, which, again, that's not the variant that I would have brought, and I didn't rate that version in my power rankings. I only rated Zebstrika, but 7.37% of the meta, that's what it accounted for, and only one in the top cut. So I'm hoping that Ursiiday continues to release these really cool graphics. I tried to make my own, but it's clearly not as fancy. But let's get into some of the hypothetical matchups. All right, so starting with the first matchup in the top 32, this is going to be a very interesting matchup because the number 1 seed is going up against a deck that they probably don't want to see very often. And, out of the 3 decks that are quote unquote at the top, this Mankey and Aerodactyl deck, it wants to see Pikachu and it wants to see Gyarados. But in this particular matchup, it's going up against Mewtwo. And for that reason, I'm going with the Mewtwo deck to win this match and knock out the number 1 seed. Now, keep in mind, if you look at the numbers, I believe it's about 30% versus 70% in terms of win rate, with the Mewtwo deck having the advantage. All right, going into the second match, this is going to be the 2 seed versus the 31 seed, and it is going to be Serebii and Exeggutor going up against Gyarados and Greninja. Now, this matchup, it's going to be very interesting because that Greninja and Gyarados deck is a force to be reckoned with, and it's going to be able to deal with just about everything in the Serebii deck. However, I do look at the matchup data, and the matchup data does say that Serebii and Exeggutor has a great chance and is actually in the advantage going up against the Gyarados Greninja deck. So I'm going to go with the Serebii and the Exeggutor deck. And again, you'll notice that it is sporting that one Snivy lineup. So this is exactly the deck that I talked about, if I remember correctly, in my power rankings. I think the only difference is there was actually one leaf. Maybe there is one leaf in place of the X speeds. But yeah, I'm going with Serebii in this matchup. And continuing through the top 32, this is the 3 seed versus the 30th seed. This is going to be Mewtwo and Gardevoir going up against Pikachu and Zebstrika, and there are some interesting deck choices in the Mewtwo deck. For example, only one Mythical Slab, which blows my mind, but that's neither here nor there. And then also the inclusion of only one Sabrina, one Giovanni, to go along with the one blue, and instead of one X speed, one leaf, they're just saying, hey, give me double leaf. Let me use all the supporters. So, looking at this matchup, it's a classic Pikachu versus Zebstrika matchup. And originally, I'm not going to lie to you, originally when I was looking at this, I did have the Mewtwo deck winning. But you know what? I'm changing that. Give me Pikachu and Zebstrika. I don't like the Mewtwo list. Give me the Pikachu Zebstrika deck list. I'll go with it, even though it's, it's also, hey, it's got the Electabuzz in there for the extra sniping potential, if I remember right. And so, when you look at this deck list, it's got the double Sabrina as well, along with the Giovanni and the potential potion that may, tip things in the favor. Give me the Pikachu Zebstrika deck, and we'll go on from there. All right, moving on to another match in the top 32. This is going to be the 4 seed versus the 29th seed. It is another Gardevoir versus Pikachu Zebstrika matchup. And in my opinion, I do think that Mewtwo usually has the advantage in this deck list versus, the Pikachu Zebstrika list. I like this Mewtwo deck list a lot more than I like the other one. For that reason, give me the Mewtwo deck to knock out this Pikachu Zebstrika deck and move on to the top 16. We've got a classic mirror match here, and when I take a look at this deck list, there's a couple of things that stand out to me in this top 32 matchup of Gyarados. And unfortunately, there's not that many Gyarados in the top cut, and one of them is going to get knocked out here, guaranteed. But when I look at these deck lists, there's a couple of choices that stand out to me. For example, normally I would say having Druddigon at 2 is an advantage. In the mirror match, I do think that it actually might be a little bit advantageous to only have one Druddigon. and to have those extra tech cards like a blue or like a potion, it might mean the difference in your Gyarados surviving in the mirror match. However, we'll see what happens. This is a coin flip, right? However, I do like the extra tech cards that blue and potion provide. So for that reason, give me the 28 seed. Give me Vincent to go ahead and win in this matchup. The deck list that is on the right. So the deck list with the blue and the potion. All right, so what is this? The genetic Apex format? All right, I'm just kidding. No bad jokes anymore. Let's talk about this matchup. It's going to be Arcazard, also known as Zarkanine, also known as Moltres, actually carries the deck, going up against another Pikachu Zebstrika deck list. This Zebstrika deck list is carrying 2 Sabrina, which I like a lot. It's got double potion, which, hey, pretty good. However, in this matchup, a lot of things are just going to get one-shotted, so that kind of might not matter. It might kind of be a dead card in this matchup. But when I take a look at this deck list matchup, I do think that the Arcazard should have the advantage. And when I look at the matchup data, it's leaning 57.14% for a win percentage for the Arcazard in this matchup. So I'm going to go ahead and stick with the numbers. I'm going to go with the data, and I'm going to go with Solid Calf, the Arcazard player, to go ahead and win this top 32 match. Now let's talk about this Superior, Celebi, and Executor deck going up against the Pikachu Zebstrika deck list. This is another list that I've flipped on. Originally, I was going with the Pikachu Zebstrika deck. However, I look at the numbers, and it looks like by the numbers, Superior Celebi has been beating Pikachu Zebstrika so far in this tournament by a rate of, it's about 54.9% of the win rate in the matchup. Also, I look at Executor as being a potential game changer if they are able to find the Executor early. And when you take a look at Celebi going up against Pikachu, Celebi may be able to outrace Pikachu, especially when you talk about using those Ericas alongside it. So give me the Superior and Celebi with Executor deck to win this matchup. And I'm going to hop back in my time machine back to the Genetic Apex format again. That's right, again. Bad jokes again. But this time we've got Zebstrika going up against a Raichu Lieutenant Surge, aka Major Bob deck. And I gotta say, a lot of the time in this matchup, I'm going to go with the Major Bob deck because Major Bob, aka Lieutenant Surge, is an absolute banger, especially in the mirror match. And so, even though I do think Zebstrika is better against a lot of the decks that, we're seeing, especially when you talk about Gyarados, I'm going to give the edge to the Raichu player here. And because of that, let me go with the Raichu Lieutenant Surge variant, moving on to the next round. And also, if you want numbers, Raichu right now has a 56.34 win percentage versus the Pikachu Zebstrika deck. So keep that in mind as well. All right, let's talk about the number 9 seed versus the 24 seed. We've got a pretty interesting matchup here. And if you have been watching my content, you know that I'm a big fan of what Jinx brings to the table. However, no Mew in this deck list makes me a little concerned. And, it might come up in this matchup because, hey, you're going to probably want Mew in some other games, maybe even this matchup. However, Jinx going into Celebi can be good for the Mewtwo player because that's Jinx may be able to get a good knockout on one of the Celebis. Especially if there's already a Superior on the field, because again, it will actually boost the damage that Jinx does as well. So in this matchup, the advantage has been in Mewtwo's favor for this tournament, 52.27% win percentage. So for this matchup, I'm going to stick with the numbers. In my opinion, I do think that the Mewtwo player will move on, even though they don't have the Mew. Okay, so for this matchup, another interesting one with a newer deck that has hit the scene and just been destroying some of the tournaments in the lower levels. I guess lower cap numbers is a better way to say it, not lower levels, but just in the 200, 300 person range. This Primeape and Aerodactyl deck list has been destroying things. And in this particular matchup, I'm an Arcazard fan. However, Arcazard has only won 20% of the games when you talk about this specific matchup. And, you know, there's not a lot of volume in this matchup so far, but I can definitely see how those numbers end up happening. If that Aerodactyl hits the board early, it might cut off some of the moves that the Arcazard player may want to do. On top of that, Hitmonlee can put pressure and put things into range while it charges up and finds, you know, the Aerodactyl, the Marshadow. So even when Arcazard makes its move, it's going to be trading, you know, one knockout and getting 1 point for potentially losing 2 points. So I'm going to go with the brand new Aerodactyl and Primeape deck, also known as Aeroape, to win this matchup. All right, so this is another interesting matchup, two newer decks, and there's not a lot of matchup data. Right now, it looks like Superior Serebii is 1-3 against Aero Mew, also known as Aerodactyl and Mew. When I look at this matchup, it's very interesting because Erica can definitely prolong the life of some of these grass Pokemon. However, when you also take a look at some of the weaknesses, like for example, there's no grass weakness, there's no psychic weakness, the weakness is not going to play a role in this matchup. The other thing that I look at here is, can Aerodactyl find ways to cut off evolutions in against this grass deck? And I think that there's a high chance of that happening. And so there's just a lot of factors here, on top of the fact that Marshadow may put in work and be a nice counter KO. The Hitmonlee may be able to put pressure on an execute before it's able to evolve. Or, you know, hey, the Sabrina might come into handy very early and knock something out. You know, when I look at the grass deck, you know, there's just not a lot of manipulation in terms of Sabrina or Giovanni. It's strictly just healing, right? So when I take a look at this matchup, I'm going to lean towards the Aerodactyl and Mew list to win this and continue the, you know, the dominance in terms of analytics and numbers. Again, 75% win rate against grass decks is the way that I've seen it so far in this tournament. So we'll just stick with the fighting deck with Splash of Mew. Man, now this was such an interesting matchup when I looked at this before I started making the video. And first of all, the funniest thing is that the person on the left, their name is USA and they have a flag from Japan, so that's hilarious to me. But okay, let's talk about the actual matchup. So this is really fascinating because when I look at this matchup, I do think that there is an advantage to having Farfetch'd in this matchup, because Farfetch'd is going to be able to one-shot without, you know, any manipulation the fossils and potentially cut the Aerodactyls and make them dead cards, you know, in this matchup. You could say the same, like, hey, well, you know, they've got Mankey and Primeape that can do the same thing to the opposing fossils, and that's fair. However, the other thing that I'd point out too is that the only reason why the deck on the left would be evolving would be to get to their Aerodactyl. However, when you take a look at the deck on the right, the Aerodactyl and Primeape deck, it's going to evolve with both of those pieces. So technically, you're going to get more value, or you should get more value out of Aerodactyl if you're playing the deck with Farfetch'd versus the deck with the Primeape here. And that's just kind of one of those things that when I was looking at this deck list, I mean, it was, man, dude, this is a fascinating, like, rogue deck matchup, right? On top of that, I do like the fact that, you know, I mentioned getting Farfetch'd lined up with the fossils. Well, check this out. There's also the fact that there's double Sabrina in the Farfetch'd deck list. So I'm going to side with Farfetch'd and double Sabrina instead of the Primeape and Mankey, along with only one Sabrina. Now, this could go either way, but I think this is actually one of the more fascinating matchups in the entire top 32. All right, so we've got another genetic Apex matchup that's sprinkled in some of the newer cards. We've got Archizard deck going up against a Mewtwo Gardevoir deck. And this is a very fascinating matchup because there is a potential for the Archizard deck to just wall out these Mewtwo's and Mew. However, if the Mew can get matched up against the Charizard, then things could get really messy for the Archizard player. This was a hard choice looking at this matchup, and I do think that there are some good things that the Mewtwo player is doing. I do think that double Mew in this matchup would probably be really, really good. Jinx may not be so good in this matchup, if I'm honest. But when I take a look at these two decks, I also look at the numbers, and Archizard is winning this matchup 57.14% of the time. So I'm going to go with the Archizard player to prevail. But man, this is anyone's game, honestly. And hey, I would not be surprised if the Mewtwo Gardevoir deck was able to pull this one off. Okay, so we have another spicy matchup in top 32 that's going to be very interesting to watch. It's definitely a newer deck because before, didn't have access to Sigilyph or Druddigon or Leaf, and those cards are going to be very important in this matchup. When I take a look at this Pikachu deck, I think that this might be a matchup where those potions come into play if you talk about knocking out a Druddigon. However, Alakazam against Pikachu is a huge problem for the Pikachu player. If this Alakazam is able to hit the board, somewhat consistently in this matchup, and then when you take a look at this Pikachu list and you realize there's no red card to disrupt the greediness that Sigilyph may bring to this matchup, I do want to say I'm going to go with the Alakazam Druddigon deck to knock out the Pikachu Zebstrika deck. It's going to be a good match, but I do think that Alakazam lines up pretty well with Pikachu, and the draw power that Sigil gives and that Slab gives, I think that that's going to help push it over the top. And, the other thing that I look at here is only one Giovanni for that Pikachu player. It might be a struggle to get over those Druddigons, potentially giving the Alakazam player more time to load up and find answers. And hey, who knows? The Pikachu may be the ultimate finisher in this matchup as well. But give me the Alakazam deck to knock out Pikachu Zebstrika here. Alright, nothing like a good old-fashioned Mewtwo Gardevoir genetic Apex mirror match. There's a couple of differences here that I want to point out that are very interesting. Now, this may look like a standard mirror match, but there's two cards overall that will potentially change this entire matchup. Giovanni on the right-hand side against red card on the left-hand side. So what this basically means is that let's just say that the player on the left uses blue to stay out of one-hit KO range from an opposing Mewtwo or an opposing Mew that's dealing 150 damage, right? With Mewtwo's giant attack. The player on the right could have Giovanni and actually cancel out that blue. However, if the player on the right decides to use blue and send in their Mewtwo EX, the player on the left has no Giovanni. And that's why I'm going to give the edge to the deck list on the right that brings Giovanni as well as blue. Red card right here may be the main reason why they lose this matchup, because they may wish that that red card was actually a Giovanni. Just my thoughts. Alright, so we've got one of the more creative decks here. Serebii and Exeggutor with Mew going up against Blaine's Ninetales. And honestly, you couldn't ask for a worse matchup probably in the entire top cut for this grass deck. But it's going up against a fire deck. And hey, I've had to do it before. I had to take Venusaur and go up against Charizard. It can be done. And you can get a win, but man, this is going to be very tough. And I do think that the stars lined up perfectly for this Blaine deck to reach the top 16. I'm going with Blaine to knock out one of the cooler decks that we've seen in this entire top 32 deck list run so far. I just think that the fire pressure is going to be way too quick and way too early. And the Exeggutor player is going to need Exeggutor EX, because Exeggutor EX and Erica are going to have to carry, especially if the Blaine's player ends up flipping some tails on that Rapidash. It's going to give some extra time for Exeggutor to get going. But yeah, I just look at this and I'm like, hey, if I'm the Blaine player, even if I open Rapidash and I have it in my hand, if I have Ninetales, I'm probably just loading up Ninetales and hoping that Ninetales can bring me to victory there. But again, give me the Blaine's deck. Pretty obvious reasons, but give me the Blaine's deck to win. All right, so now these are all just my predictions for a matchup that may never happen. So, hey, we'll just see how this plays out. It could work out a way different way, but hey, I just wanted to do this for fun, give you guys some extra entertainment before the top 32 unfolds, and then we'll come back and take a look at it. But in this hypothetical, and if things work out the way that I'm betting on them working out, you're going to see number 32 seed go up against the 17th seed. This is going to be Mewtwo versus Blaine, and even though I don't necessarily like the Mewtwo list, I think that one slab is probably not good. I think you probably should play 2 of that card. Maybe they only had 1. I don't know. I'm not going to sit here and judge, but I do think that Mewtwo will probably be too much for the Blaine's Ninetales deck. The big curveball here is if the Blaine's Ninetales deck can flip some heads with that Rapidash, if it goes second, or even if it goes first, if it could start flipping some heads early and putting a lot of pressure on that Mewtwo, it may make the Mewtwo deck uncomfortable. And if it can secure an early knockout on a Mewtwo, all bets are off. But give me the Mewtwo deck to move on and advance to the top 8. So for top 16, we've got another classic genetic Apex matchup. This is going to be Raichu going up against Mewtwo Gardevoir. And again, the list is a little wonky with no Mew EX, but they do include Jinx as well as Red Card. So honestly, this matchup, it could go a lot of ways. I'm going to lean on the Raichu variant knocking out the Mewtwo variant just because Raichu is such a big factor and when you talk about this matchup. And Jinx doesn't feel like it's going to do too much in this matchup. Probably going to get KO'd by a Pikachu if it goes out there. And then with no extra fodder to take damage, it feels like there's just no baby Mewtwo, there's no Mew. I think that's going to really show in this matchup, and that's another reason why I'm going with the Raichu deck to win and advance to top 8. All right, another classic genetic Apex matchup. This time in top 16, we've got Ursiiday taking on Mewtwo. In this matchup, I think that there is a chance that Charizard comes out and just really takes a hold on this game. The big curveball is if Mew can counter that Charizard. However, I just want to, probably take the Ursiiday in this matchup, and probably saying that, hey, the Ursiiday finds a way to get the job done. But again, this is a tough one because that Mew is going to just be such a curveball. If that Mew can find a way to get 3 energy and match up with the Charizard, when the Charizard player maybe just isn't able to counter it, that could be a big problem. So yeah, give me the Ursiiday to win. But man, this one, hypothetically, pretty close game. So we've got a Sniper going up against a Gyarados deck. And, when you take a look at this matchup, that's the first thing that really stands out is the fact that, hey, there's potential that Aerodactyl can block a lot of plays here, especially in combination with Sabrina. But also, when you take a look at Hitmonlee potentially lining up with those Magikarps, and then if they decide to say, hey, well, I'll just put the Magikarp in the active, well, Farfetch can take care of it. So looking at this matchup, I think the advantage is going to go to the Aerodactyl and Farfetch deck. So count on the Aerodactyl and Farfetch deck, USA, to take this down and advance to top 8. Okay, so we've got a Serebii, Executor, and Superior deck going up against a Mewtwo deck. And previously, when I looked at these numbers, it did seem like the Mewtwo Gardevoir deck usually has the advantage in this matchup. So even though, it may be a pretty hot deck, for this tournament, this Serebii Executor deck, I'm going to go with the Mewtwo deck to take home this matchup and advance to the top 8. Okay, so we've got spicy decks on the right going up against a Executor and Serebii and Superior deck. Now, when I take a look at this matchup, there could be a type mismatch, but all of these fighting Pokemon are actually going to be weak to things other than grass. So when I take a look at this matchup, I do think that, there could be some issues with the tempo and pressure that the fighting deck puts on Serebii and all of its friends. And so because of that early tempo and just kind of looking at the way that these kind of like fighting decks have been able to put a lot of pressure on these grass decks that want to take time as they build up, unless they open Executor, I do think that I'm going to give the advantage to the fighting deck here, especially, when you talk about that Marshadow technology that can come in and revenge KO. The math is really solid for Primeape and Marshadow. But again, all of that's going to kind of depend on, hey, do they find the Primeape, which, you'd argue that they should, unless it's, they're just really unlucky. So give me the fighting deck to move on in this matchup. Okay, so for this top 16 match, I do think that the Alakazam deck will get another matchup with a Pikachu Zebstrika deck, and I do give the advantage to Alakazam again because of the reasons that I previously mentioned, but again, that draw power and the fact that Alakazam can deal with just about everything in the deck. I mean, outside of like a Zapdos with like only 2 energy, I think is kind of the way the math, actually, yeah, even with 2 energy with Giovanni, it could potentially get there. So yeah, I do want to give the advantage here to the Alakazam deck and have it move on to the top 8. Okay, so we've got a spicy deck going up against Arcazard, and one of the things that I think Arcazard does a really good job of is being pretty bulky. Obviously, things like Gyarados have kind of changed how we think about bulk, but even with that considered, the HP in this Arcazard deck, I think, is going to be a big hill to overcome, unless, the fighting deck with Aerodactyl and Tauros and Marshadow and Hitmonlee, unless they're able to really just have a lot of tempo at the beginning of the game. Maybe Aerodactyl plays a role in this game as well and potentially blocks some evolutions if they get stuck in the active. That's definitely a possibility, but with double X speed and Leaf, I think that they'll be able to get out of the active pretty easily. So for that reason and the bulk, give me Arcazard to move on and knock out this Aero Mew list and advance to the top 8. Okay, classic matchup here. Pikachu going up against Mewtwo. I do think that Mewtwo is going to be able to move on in this hypothetical matchup if it gets to this point and gets this matchup. So give me Mewtwo to advance to the top 4, knocking out this Pikachu and Raichu deck. Although, again, it is worth noting, hey, this Raichu deck definitely has a shot, especially with a card like Raichu. Yeah, in this matchup, you've got a lot of bulk in that Arcazard deck going up against a deck that definitely can put pressure on that Moltres very quickly, and obviously the Aerodactyl can potentially block some of those evolutions. But because of the bulk and the firepower that the deck has, give me Arcazard knocking off this Aerodactyl and Farfetch'd deck and moving on to the top 4. Alright, so we've got an Aerodactyl and Primeape deck going up against a Mewtwo Gardevoir deck, and the weakness to Psychic is going to definitely play a role in this matchup. There is some interesting math where potentially Mankey or Primeape could, maybe get 50 damage on a Mewtwo, get knocked out, and then Marshadow could potentially come in and knock out the Mewtwo. That could definitely happen, but things like Blue, things like Giovanni can definitely mess with that math. But with all that said, give me the bulk and the sheer power of Mewtwo to win this matchup and advance to the top 4. Okay, so in this top 8 matchup, I've got Alakazam going up against Arcazard, and I do think that the fact that Alakazam is able to one-shot just about everything that can be put out there if it's powered up definitely plays a role. But again, Charizard is tanky enough. Maybe it knocks something out, only has 2 energies left, could be a little bit of a curveball, and there's no Mew to come in and save the day. But give me Alakazam pulling off this matchup and advancing to the top 4. Okay, so we finally got to the top 4. We've got this Mewtwo list going up against Ursiiday, and I know that I've kind of hit on it a few times, but man, this one mythical slab kind of bothers me a little bit. The fact that they're not playing 2, and that in this matchup, I don't think that the potions are going to come into play very much, because I think that a lot of the time the knockouts are just going to be one hits if Ursiiday is knocking things out. Give me the Ursiiday deck to win in the top 4 if this matchup happens and advance to the finals. Okay, we finally got another matchup that involves the Alakazam deck with a Psychic deck, which will be Mewtwo along with Mew EX. I think that the fact that Mewtwo cannot be one-shot by these Pokemon is going to be huge, unless the Mewtwo just somehow, has 3 energy, which that should never be the case. I do think that the Mewtwo deck should be able to overcome the Alakazam deck, and so I'm taking Gardevoir and Mewtwo to win over the Alakazam deck and advance to the finals. So in my projected finals, it's going to come down to Ursiiday versus Mewtwo. And even though I do think that Mewtwo definitely is a very strong deck, I think this is a very solid deck list. I do think that Ursiiday is actually going to surprise a lot of people, and in this scenario, give me Ursiiday to win the entire tournament in the Ursiiday tournament for the weekend. Now, this is just my projections outside of the top 32. I mean, none of this may happen. Who knows? We'll see. But I hope you enjoyed the video, and I do want to bring more content like this every weekend. So hit that subscribe button at the bottom of the right. Thank you for taking time out of your day for me to be entertainment, background noise. Maybe you got a little excited on some of these matchups, but we'll see how they play out, and I'll catch you later. Peace.